Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek The Next Generation Season 1. In this video, I will cover every episode of Season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This is part of a series of videos where I cover every single episode of Star Trek The Next Generation one season at a time. So getting into Star Trek The Next Generation, it's actually been a while since I've seen season 1 of The Next Generation in its entirety from start to finish. Like, I've seen episodes from it here and there, but I think it's been like a couple decades since I actually sat down and watched the entire thing in order from start to finish. And it's actually worse than I remember. Like, I've always said on my channel in my reviews that the first season of Next Generation was not good, but I think I kind of underestimated how not good it was. Now, I also did this kind of coverage for Star Trek Enterprise, in which in that case I called the first 2 seasons of Enterprise the worst 2 seasons of the entire Star Trek franchise, and I said that clearly it was worse than Next Generation Season 1. Now, watching Next Generation Season 1, I still stand by that statement that Season 1 and 2 of Enterprise is worse than Season 1 of Next Gen, but not by much. After seeing Next Gen, I realized that the difference between them is not that sparse, that Next Generation Season 1 probably is only just edges out the first 2 seasons of Enterprise. It's that comparable to being that bad, because I talked about when I had to watch the first 2 seasons of Enterprise how painful it was to get through and how I hated doing it. I experienced that same discomfort and same, why am I doing this to myself, when watching season 1 of Next Generation. Of course, the difference is Next Generation goes on to be a much better show, but then again, it had a lot more seasons to do so than Enterprise did. So the bulk of Next Generation show is great, whereas Enterprise is more of half and half. Now, there's several reasons why I would say Next Generation Season 1 is slightly better than the first 2 seasons of Enterprise. First of all, I have to give extra allotments to Next Gen because it had such a shoestring budget and it was syndicated. It was a syndicated show on a shoestring budget, and so of the 80s. And if you look at syndicated shows from the 80s, they kind of look like this. It kind of has that syndicated feel to it. Also, this was the first time that they were trying to do something different with Star Trek, because before this episode premiered, before Encounter at Farpoint, all Star Trek was Kirk, Spock, Scotty, McCoy, and they had made it big in the movies, and so the transition to something different was a huge risk, and I can kind of understand them not knowing how to actually handle that properly. Whereas with Enterprise, they were building off of decades of huge success of Star Trek show after Star Trek show with Deep Space Nine and Voyager. Now, you could say those shows were kind of lukewarm reception here and there, although they had a much deeper following, particularly Deep Space Nine. And, of course, Next Generation had its success. So Enterprise was building off all of that, so for it to fall so flat, I think, is definitely a worse example. So I give more leeway to Next Generation being first. But the main reason why I would say it's slightly better is because of the cast of characters was there. Like, they had the infrastructure for a good show. They were just failing to do so. Like, they had very interesting characters. Picard, Riker, Data, and particularly LaForge, Council of Troy, Worf. Like, you had a great cast of characters, and their characters really shining through, even through this crappy season. Whereas with Enterprise, that cast of characters was flat, boring, and uninteresting, Dr. Phlox being the only interesting one, whereas there you got bland Mayweather, Hoshi, characters you don't even remember because they're so flat and two-dimensional, almost indistinguishable from each other. Whereas the main characters, Archer, Trip, and T'Pol, were just copies, stereotypes of previous Star Trek characters like McCoy, Spock, and Scotty. So, and Kirk, of course. And so, Next Generation, it was actually trying not to be like the original series. It was trying to do something new and fresh, and having these totally different characters: an android, demure French captain, freaking Klingon on the bridge with something like that. So Next Generation did a much better job at having a baseline and infrastructure that was a lot more fresh, original, and worked than Enterprise did. And a premise to the show. This is 1,000 years or 100 years into the future of what we know of Star Trek, which is this is going to really unexplored territory where Enterprise, let's just do a prequel. And this is going to be like an astronaut show. That's very bland premise. So that's why I give Next Generation Season 1, I would put it slightly above the first 2 seasons of Enterprise. But if I'm just judging by like the script writing and the storytelling, in some instances, if I'm being honest, I gotta say some of these episodes of Next Generation are worse than Enterprise, because Enterprise's main fault was, in its first 2 seasons, that it was boring. It was bland and uninteresting. Where Next Generation went a bit above being boring. It was outright silly, cheesy, and horribly written in some cases. But as I said, those earlier things I said, I still hold Next Generation slightly above. But and if I'm being honest with myself, in some instances it was actually a little worse. But overall, I would say it's slightly better. But and here's the thing about. And I've said in the past that Next Generation Season 2 was the worst season. And I have yet to watch Season 2 as of the recording of this video. I mean, watch it again. Obviously, I've seen it a dozen billion times before, but not very recently. I haven't watched it, recently yet. But after watching Season 1, I highly doubt that I will maintain that position. That Season 2 was worse than Season 1. I don't see how it could be. And from my recollection with episodes like Measure of the Man and a few other episodes I really enjoyed, I can't see how it could be worse than this season. The thing I will say about Season 1 of Next Generation is that it does get better towards the end. This negative impression I had was mainly the first half of the season, which was absolutely terrible and horrendous. But it gets better towards the end. You have a lot more, I noticed with my ratings that I give it, I have a lot higher ratings towards the end of the season. And plus, I have some opinions on some of these episodes that may surprise you and go against the majority of what people generally believe. But anyway, it's also interesting if you heard about all of the behind the scenes turmoil. In fact, there was an entire documentary that was narrated by William Shatner. I think it's on Netflix. It was called Chaos on the Bridge, which covered the turmoil, the very toxic environment that there was making this show. And apparently, the entire show, it was being generous to say was on a shoestring budget. Apparently they were having to steal food from other productions to feed their cast and stuff. Their budget was so small it was ridiculous. But the behind the scenes, apparently it was very hostile, and writers got fired right and left, and Gene Roddenberry's lawyer was going around being an asshole to everyone, and the showrunner Maurice Hurley, a lot of negative things have been said about him as well. So I mean, if you have such a low budget in a toxic environment, it's actually kind of amazing that the show was as good as it was. Now, obviously, I think a lot of this had to do, again, with the infrastructure, the concept of the show being so good and having such good designs, like the ship design of the Enterprise D and stuff like that. Although the uniforms could have used a bit more work. They looked silly in the first 2 seasons. But it kind of is understandable why some of these episode scripts were so terrible if the writers were really unhappy and that the staff was really disorganized and the writers were getting fired right and left and it was a hostile work environment. This, of course, will change in Season 3 where everything gets better, but of course I'll cover that when I get to it. Now, as far as my personal experience with the Next Generation, this is something I'll probably talk about here or maybe bring up a few times. I was 9 years old when the show first came out, and I did not watch it. At this age, I was in a I hate Star Trek mood. I don't know why. I think it's because my mom watched it all the time when I would rather her being paying attention to me. So I just like, well, screw this show. I hate it and I don't like it. And it wasn't until I was 12 years old when my brother showed me Wrath of Khan that I actually started to like Star Trek. In fact, I immediately got into it. As soon as I got into it, I started watching all the reruns of the original series and Next Generation and taping them, and of course watching new episodes of Next Generation as well. And this was during Next Generation fifth season, so when season 5 was airing. So I was watching new episodes of season 5 week to week, but then I was going back and watching reruns. But because season 4 had just come out on reruns, the reruns I was watching was mostly from season 4. Although they did cycle through seasons 1 and 2, but season 3, it actually took me much, much longer to get. Like, I only saw like this odd episode here and there from season 3, so season 3 was kind of a bit taboo for me. And so all the references made in season 4 to season 3 or earlier seasons, like, usually went over my head. And even some of these talk about in season 1, some of the references that I saw season 4 first, so I got some of these references first from seeing season 4 to season 5, which was airing at the time. But I did see season 1, 2 kind of earlier on, and I kind of mixed in my mind with the later seasons, even though I would later come to really distinguish between the quality of them. But anyway, let me go ahead and get started on this episode by episode review. So let's start with the first episode, Encounter at Farpoint. Alright, so actually before I get into that, I do want to say for each episode, since I talked about how a lot of it is not good. In fact, it's going to take a while before there's an episode that's actually good. So when I do my rewatch of this, I usually give each episode a rating from 1 to 10, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best. Now, what I consider a negative rating is that anything I give a 1 through 5 is considered negative, although 5 is more like it's just okay, but it's more of the negative side of okay, whereas 6 is also just okay, but more of the positive side of okay, if that makes any sense. So 6 through 10 is considered a positive rating for me, where 1 through 5 is considered a negative rating. So I usually don't give my ratings as I go through these season reviews, but as I'm going through each episode, I will say whether or not I'll just let you know when I give a positive rating, because for most of it, they're negative ratings, and this is going to be hold true for this first episode, Encounter at Farpoint, and for a while. So I'll let you know when I get to a positive episode. Anyway, first episode, Encounter at Farpoint. My brother did a similar review to this where he covered... is kind of where I got the idea from, if I'm being honest, where he covered each season of Next Generation and covered every episode in the season. And I think he summed it up best about Encounter at Farpoint, where this was just a show trying to show off how cool and different it was, and look at all this cool new stuff we have. Look, the Enterprise can separate. Look, there's McCoy. Look, there's a guy with a visor. Look, there's a holodeck. And It really comes off this way. But I would sort of add that the structure of the story here reminds me a lot of Star Trek the motion picture. And if you know my opinion on the motion picture, I think that the whole movie is a mess. And I don't know why there's been a recent like hipster uprising that actually likes that movie and said, "Oh, it's artsy." No, it's a mess. It was very poorly constructed. If you watch any of the behind the scenes stuff in that movie, you can see all the chaos there. And it's obvious that chaos is here as well. But in both cases, Gene Roddenberry was heavily involved, so I suspect he had something to do with it. Now, both the similarities, the obvious similarities between Next Gen and between Encounter Farpoint in particular and the motion pictures, that they were both being adapted from the abandoned Star Trek Phase 2 project. Now, if you're not aware, Phase 2 was a project they were going to do in the late 70s because Star Trek was getting a lot of popularity at conventions, and it was being more popular in the 70s than it was than when it aired in the 60s. Even though it had been canceled for like 10 years. So they wanted to bring it back as a TV show, so they came up with this Phase 2 that was going to be aired, and I believe on NBC. And I don't know. It was going to be aired on television. And so they already started like pre-production on it. They were building models. They started casting. They had written scripts. But then during pre-production, the studio changed their minds and decided, well, let's make a movie instead. So a lot of those casting pre-productions were shifted towards making this movie, Star Trek the Motion Picture, which was actually based off of a script for Phase 2, which is kind of why it sucked, because they were trying to stretch out a script. And there's a couple episodes of Next Generation that were based off of scripts, but one is in Season 2, The Child, and the other's not until Season 4, Devil's Due, which was actually a decent episode. But anyway, so this one was not based off of a script from Phase 2, but so by the time we get to the Next Generation, so what is it? 9 years later? About 10 years later, if we're talking pre-production terms. Maybe 9, 8, something like that. And so at this point, Roddenberry, whatever, they still want to do a Star Trek show, but the Phase 2 isn't really option anymore because they can't really bring back William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and Forrest Kelly, because they're doing these movies now, particularly with Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home just came out, which it was a box office smash. It made a lot of money. So there's no way, especially considering the shoestring budget we know this show has, there's no way they could afford to pay those actors and bring back the same actors. And plus the story of those characters had already moved on with the movies, so it seems like they brought another show that would interfere with the movie series. So Roddenberry decided to create a whole nother concept, go 100 years into the future. But you could see that there's some bare bone elements of Phase 2 still in here, and the most obvious, most particular ones are with Riker and Troy, who are obviously based off of Decker and Ayala, who were from Phase 2, who were put into the motion picture. They were using the motion picture, so they couldn't use a specific character, so they invented new characters who were kind of the same, how they were once lovers and once sort of more emotional, like in Ayala was Delton or whatever that was. I'm still not sure what Delton's deals are, but I'm not getting into that. But they created like an empath or whatever instead for Troy, but they had that same sort of similar vibe, similar relationship. And there's a lot of other sort of hang-ups. You can tell that Roddenberry was kind of reinventing Phase 2 to make it fit this new concept of being 100 years in the future and having totally different characters. Which was kind of interesting. And I think because Picard, even though he's very not Kirk-like, he's kind of, because in the Phase 2 or in the movies, Kirk is more of an admiral type, where there's a younger sort of swashbuckler who used to be like what Kirk was like in the 60s, so they wanted to reintroduce that dynamic with Picard and Riker, like Picard being the older, wiser one, and Riker being this swashbuckler that Kirk used to be. But anyway, so Encounter at Farpoint reminds me a lot of the motion picture, and they do have those ties through Phase 2, but it reminds me a lot of it because it seems like it stretches on for too long and has that same, and I kind of see Roddenberry's fingers on it, and to be honest, he's not a very good story script writer. He's good ideas, man, I won't deny him that, but yeah. Anyway, it's because like the motion picture, it's trying to do too much, and it's just stretching things out a lot longer than it needs to. With Encounter at Farpoint, this story's a mess. I mean, he had this concept of Q, who they do go on and make Q a really great character later in the show. But in this episode, he's not that good. I'm sorry, I'm going to be honest. He's a stereotypical... He is, like... This episode is too much like the original series. The original series always had these godlike characters come in and go wah, 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 and so it seems like they're doing the same thing, and they're being quite obvious on the nose about, oh, this show's going to be about how much better humanity is in the future. So in this case, is the whole conflict is Q saying, oh, humans are barbarians, and Picard's no, we're so much better, this future is great, blah blah blah. It's just a way for Roddenberry to be preachy about how much better humans are in the future. And he doesn't actually work in season 1. And he kind of works in season 2, which I'll cover, but I don't think it's till season 3 where they finally nail Q as a character. This episode, I mean, much like most of the characters in Next Gen, the bare bones is there for an interesting character. So like you can see elements of Q in this this performance here, and you could tell that they focused on those good elements and they accentuate them and make them into something better in later seasons. But overall, he's like, they play him, the way he's played here is so much different than the way he'll be played in the future. He's a lot more petty, he's a lot more antagonist. In the future, he's more of he's a lot more like lighthearted and comedic in the future than he is here. Even in episodes that are more dire, like Tapestry and All Good Things, he's still kind of more lighthearted and comedic. Where here they're trying to play him off as this big evil bad guy, and it doesn't really make sense. If he's all powerful, all knowing, then he should know all this stuff about Picard. Like a lot, and this is a problem throughout most of the season 1, is a lot of the dialogue and situations are very contrived and very telegraphed. Like this is a very telegraphed. You could say, oh well, it's an 80s show, but there's plenty of 80s shows that weren't like this. That were very like, oh, we're going on an adventure and this is why, and blah blah blah. And it's like the dialogue is just really horribly written, and it doesn't feel natural at all. It's so telegraphed. It's like Picard saying, oh, this Farpoint station could be an interesting challenge for us, and it's obvious that the scriptwriter is saying this is going to be an interesting episode. But in the one case I actually agree with was at the end of the episode where where Riker is like, oh, that was quite an adventure we had, and Picard is like, oh no, our adventures from now on are going to be much more exciting than this, which he's right, because that was boring. It was so oddly placed, and apparently they had several ideas that they tried to mesh together, which is also happened with the motion picture, and like with the squid aliens. Now I could nitpick a lot of things about how some of the things with the squid alien thingies just don't make any sense. Like in one case, like at the end where Picard realized the Farpoint station was an alien, he's like, oh, tell everyone to evacuate Farpoint station, and like 2 minutes later the alien they fire a beam that feeds the alien and flies off. I don't think that's enough time for them to evacuate a whole space station, just 2 minutes. I don't know. That's just me. Yeah, you have two plots. You got the Q, which was a bit silly. You got the one with the aliens that I think were a bit better, but it was a bit mishandled. But you don't need all the runtime you get, just like the motion picture. They spent a lot of time just like having these characters. You're trying to do character building, but it comes off as really silly, like Riker watching a DVD of what happened with Q and them in the holodeck. Like, just the dialogue is just so unnatural and just really poorly written. But anyway, yeah, so this one's definitely, I don't think it's a good episode. I saw this once, there was a countdown of top 10 Next Gen episodes. I had this episode in and I was like, whoa there. I mean, God, I know it's the first episode and all. You kind of need to watch it to get like the setting of the show, but it's not one of the best episodes of the show. It's an insult to this show to say this is. This is actually not a very good episode at all. I'm sorry. Anyway, it's not the worst though. So we get to the next episode, which is The Naked Now, which is considerably worse. So this is when I first started watching Next Gen, I mostly just knew the original series. This is what I wanted to see. Ooh, Next Generation did a version of this original series episode. Ooh, I kind of thought maybe that's all Next Generation was. Thank God it wasn't. And it's funny because Next Gen's, the premise tried so hard to differentiate itself from the original series and be a totally new show, but they made this episode which is the exact same thing pretty much. Everyone, they find another, I think in the original series it was a colony on an outpost on a planet, but this time it's another ship, potato, but they go over there and everyone is dead. They killed themselves because they contracted this disease that makes them intoxicated, and then Enterprise pick up this disease, they bring it back, and one of the junior officers goes a bit crazy. In this case it's LaForge, and the disease starts to spread around, and eventually it spreads around to this young teenager in Next Gen, and the original series is O'Reilly, and Next Gen is Wesley, of course, and they take over engineering and start like acting all drunk and crazy and actually put the ship in peril because they disable the engines, which they need the engines to escape this peril that they're in. This episode's decidedly worse than The Naked Time, which is actually one of the better episodes of the original series. I mean, partly because, of course, it's just copying what another thing already did, which automatically makes it worse. But also, like, you just don't buy it. It just doesn't work as good. And the original Naked Time, it felt like these people were drunk. Where here, it just makes everyone horny. It just makes everyone want to have sex. And of course we get the classic scene where Data and Yar have sex, and apparently this will actually be referenced many times in the future, like in the far future, like after Yar has passed. And so they obviously weren't intending it to be like that. They were just trying to make something out of it that wasn't really there, in my opinion. Like, they just got drunk and had a one-night stand, but later seasons treat it like they had this ongoing intimate relationship, but whatever. I still don't buy that Data gets this disease, by the way. I think this is the second episode before they clearly establish what Data's like, but all future portrayals of Data show that he's completely impervious to disease, and whenever there is like a virus or disease around, he can go wherever because he's shown as not contracting it, which makes sense because he is an android and doesn't have biological components, so it makes zero sense. And they try to explain it, like when Picard's like, no, not you, Data. It's like, oh, if you prick me, do I not blink? Haha, that's supposed to be funny. But it doesn't fucking explain why Data gets it. This is ridiculous. Also really irks me, and this is something my brother points out a lot. I think he was the first one to point it out to me, but I can't unsee it, and it really bothers the fuck out of me why Riker is so resistant to this disease more than any others, because he gets it from Troy, he passes it to Crusher passes it to Picard, and then Picard is more disabled than he is, and Riker has to take command because Picard's too disabled. Picard instantly starts acting drunk, like Crusher just breathes on him and he starts going, "Oh, okay, Beverly." Where Riker is still in the command of the factory, where Picard is 2 steps down from Riker. Like Riker gave it to Beverly and Beverly gave it to Picard. It's ridiculous. It bothers me so much now. Whenever I see Riker is like, "Oh, I'll take command," I'm like, "Why are you still functional, Riker?" It bothers me. It pisses me off. Anyway, so this is a really bad episode. Let me get into the next episode, which is, speaking of bad episodes, we still haven't gotten to the positives yet, that's for sure. Code of Honor! Now, this episode is infamous for being one of the worst, if not the worst, episodes of The Next Generation. Now, to be honest, whenever I've done worst lists in the past, this episode kind of never really made it for me. And a lot of people were like, "Oh my god, how could you not mention Code of Honor?" Well, I don't know. Like, this episode, I never liked this episode. I always thought it was terrible. But it never stood out to me as much as some of the other episodes. I mean, partly because this is season 1, it's the first half of season 1, which is all terrible, because so all this terribleness kinds of blends in to me, whereas if you have a really bad episode in like something like season 6, that stands out to me a lot more, and I notice it a lot more because it's surrounded by all these great episodes and it shouldn't be there, where here this is kind of like par for the course. It's, all this shit's terrible, but not giving it too much of a pass for being in season 1, because it does stand out more than the other episodes. And as I said, I never liked this episode. I always thought it was silly and boring, but it wasn't until I was much older and more recent years that I heard about how, that I realized how racist and sexist it is. Now, to give this episode a bit of leeway, I do believe that it wasn't the intention, particularly of the writer of the episode, for this to be racist. And maybe even, although it's said, I've heard somewhere, I don't know if this is true, but that the director of this episode was a documented racist and he got fired and someone else had to finish the episode for him. But the writer, I could see what they had in mind. And really, this was based off of, like, the feel and concept of the story was based off of adventure epics from, like, the 19th century or early 20th century. The mainly, like, English works that viewed, like, places like Africa and India as exotic and different and alien and strange places. It's about, like, the cultural difference of people from the Western world, typically England, going to these places, and how and it's trying to convey that awe and a sense of being in an alien place or a very strange place that someone from England would experience when going to some of these places, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century, where the world wasn't quite as unified as it is now, like through internet, airplanes, and whatnot. But the thing is I think that this episode is so horribly written and horribly executed that it does come off as racist. I think that's why I think the racism was unintentional. I think they were trying to just emulate classic storytelling, which Star Trek and a lot of other shows do a lot. It's just they handled it so poorly. They weren't aware that if you translate it into this particular format of a space show, a science fiction show, and say, oh, they're going to another planet where everyone there looks just like humans, and oh, they all happen to look like black, and they all happen to be black, and all happen to dress like Africans. Not seeing how that's actually really portraying it as quite racist as, because it's portraying these places like, you can kind of give those stories I talked about from the 19th century past because it's from an English perspective or Western perspective, and to them these places are exotic. But from a place where even in present times where Earth is more unified, and especially in the 24th century where Earth was supposed to be a bunch of aliens unified, and Earth is supposed to be a representation like Starfleet, and the Enterprise is supposed to be a representation of all peoples from Earth. By having a predominantly white crew go to this weird alien place where it's basically Africans, that is extremely racist. It's betraying. It's betraying. It's Orientalism, I think, is the term for it. It's betraying these different cultures that are human, that are of Earth, as different, as alienating them, and that the norm is the white European or white Americans, and that's and. As I say, I don't think the show intended to do that, because you could say, oh, well, Geordie LaForge is in the crew too, but he didn't factor in that much in this episode. Let's be honest, or Worf for that matter. They did focus on more of the sort of white characters. And sort of portrayed, this is this weird backward culture. Now, I can actually, some of the dialogue and writing does lead me to believe that they intended this to actually be an homage to this culture and sort of celebrating the cultural diversity. I just think they totally fucked the execution up of the story, that it actually came out the opposite. And because it originally, as it was written, it didn't necessarily say that every one of these aliens were supposed to be black or look like Africans. That's the choice of the production design of the directorial team. So there were a lot of fuck ups along the way. It was just a bad episode. Like the story, and of course not even getting into the sexism part of it, where women are treated like property. And the whole thing about where the guy, it's two women literally fighting over this guy. It's just I don't know. And the way Picard is sort of portrayed here, where he kind of gives in because he wants this vaccine. He gives in so much. It's why don't you go ahead and fight to the death? And they wait an hour, the whole entire day before getting Tasha Yar after she's been abducted. I don't know. It's just a really terribly written episode all along. So, I don't know. I will definitely, I'm not going to argue with anyone that says this is the worst episode of Next Gen, or one of the worst. I might consider it one of the worst. Maybe it will crack my top 10 this time. But, as I said, it kind of, it does stand out a bit more than some of the other Season 1 episodes, but it has that same really poorly written qualities throughout all of Season 1. So maybe that's why it doesn't stick out as much to me as it should. But I never liked this episode. I always thought it was poor. But I will say, there was something from this episode I always used to quote that kind of stuck in my head after seeing it all the time, where the dude's like, then you will have no treaty, no vaccine, and no Lieutenant Yar. I feel bad for quoting such a horrible racist episode anyway, but I don't know. That always stuck in my head. Anyway. Let's move over to the next episode, which is, oh my god, no, we're still not getting to the good stuff. A lot of bad episodes to start with. Last Outpost. Oh, you haven't seen the last when Mordok is around. Sorry. Oh my god. So this is the introduction of the Ferengi, who were originally intended to be the main villains of the Next Generation. And after this episode in the battle, the showrunners obviously, very correctly said, oh my god, these are horrible. They can't be the main villain. Let's get rid of them. Now again, this is probably a better example than Q, because these were even worse than Q. This is an example where they actually made them better in later seasons and later shows of Star Trek. Is that, and by making them more comedic. as how they sort of, and they didn't really, I would say they weren't intentionally comedic in this episode, at least not in the way the Ferengi are known to be in future seasons of Star Trek. They were supposed to be definitely more menacing, and were presented more as the adversary to the Enterprise, as the big villains. And no, absolutely not. Looking back on it after watching the animated series recently, I realized that some of these aliens that were presented in the animated series were very similar to the demeanor the Ferengi acted in this episode. But of course, that was a cartoon, so that was excusable. It's less excusable here. Now, the Ferengi were originally supposed to be like Gene Roddenberry's commentary on out of control capitalism, like Wall Street, corrupt Wall Street culture, and stuff like that. And because it's obvious he does a lot of that commentary in season 1 of Next Gen, but this is like the worst execution of that idea you could possibly get, because this is not a good analogy for Wall Street corruption. I'm sorry. If I see these trolly looking aliens jumping around going like does not make me think Wall Street. I mean you could have like these demure, like really rich, slick back hair, nice business suit alien types, then that might make me think more of Wall Street. In fact, I still contend, and I did this whole video when I did my review of Q Who about this, that the Borg was originally that reconception, because they failed so badly with the Ferengi. It was a reconception of them because their ships look like office buildings. They're all drones. They all think like kind of like people with business suits. A lot of people call them, people work those typical business suit jobs, drones and stuff like that. And they all want to control everything. And the Borg were originally presented as just stealing all the technologies, just like capitalism takes technology for. I talked all about this in my. Even though I will admit Voyager and later shows of Star Trek definitely portrayed the Borg more as a socialism thing, extreme socialism. But I think these earlier depictions, particularly in Q Who, was meant to be. But I digress a lot. Getting back to the Last Outpost, this episode was okay. I don't think it's the worst thing ever, because I think the concept of the two enemies fighting each other and being trapped by a greater force from the surface, and at first they think it's coming from each other because they're so fixated on each other, and realizing that there's a greater threat, and then Riker going down there and sort of elating this alien creature by impressing him with his philosophy. Like that was good. I all like that. But a lot of the shit surrounding it was just awful. Like, not even just the Ferengi. There's also the stuff with like the Chinese finger puzzle thing. Like Data gets trapped, like an android with supreme strength and intelligence gets trapped in the Chinese finger puzzle, whatever it's called. That's fucking ridiculous. And the jokes they had is simply not funny. And oh my god. And then let's get to the actual Ferengi. Once they get down to the planet's surface, like the way they're portrayed here is, what the hell were they thinking? Like, why did they think this would actually look... I don't know who the hell directed this episode. I know that Armin Shimmerman actually played one of the Ferengis in this episode, and he would, of course, later go on to play Quark in Deep Space Nine. And he talked about how much he regretted his performance in this episode, and that he did a really bad job, and he was glad he was able to redeem himself, because Quark, of course, became a really beloved character and sort of the iconic Ferengi character, and that's what the Ferengi will be known to be. But here, I don't know if I blame him specifically, though, because obviously I think since all the Ferengi in this episode are acting like that, it was a directorial decision, or a decision sort of higher up, that they all, like, crawl out going, I gave this to the human. Oh, they dress their females up. It's revolting. And, like, the more the episode goes on, the more manic they get. And that one scene where Riker is talking to that one dude from the Fallen Empire, and the Ferengis are all just like crowding around them, running circles, and I'm just like, oh my god, stop it, make it stop! What the fuck is going on here? So, not the worst episode ever, but no, just no. Anyway. Let's get to the next episode, which is Where No One Has Gone Before. And finally we arrive at an episode that I've given a positive rating to. A 7. Finally. Now, I do really like this episode. But I used to call this like the best episode of season 1, but I don't think I maintain that. Although it was definitely the first good episode of the show. That's for sure. There's still a lot of problems with the dialogue and a lot of cheesiness that still comes off. That a lot of fake. There's a lot of the same telegraphed dialogue I was talking about. I was like, oh, but they're here to fix the engine. Uh-oh, we better be sure because this could lead to a wacky adventure. I don't know. They didn't say that exactly, but they might as well have. It's very similar. And just I think, I can't remember that engineer's, name dude who was it Krasinski or something like that? He was, the Traveler was his assistant, and he was taking all the credit. Oh, I'm doing this because I'm a genius. Like, they overplayed his, egotism to an extent where it came off as cartoonish. Now, I do realize that there are some really egotistical people in real life, but I think, later episodes of Star Trek will better portray that kind of egotism in a more realistic way. Here, it was too over the top, where it was just really cartoonish. But I do think this is a really wonderful episode because it has a lot of wonder in it, I shall say. It's what kind of Star Trek Next Generation is known for best, is having that sort of wonder, exploration of the mind. Having the ship sort of fly like 2 galaxies away in an instant. It was really fascinating in seeing how they would deal with this. And I do think that this episode is also the basis for the show Star Trek Voyager, because it's kind of like, well, what if the Enterprise never did get home? Because at the end of the episode they figure out a way to get back home. But what if they didn't? What if they were stuck out there forever? Of course, in this episode, it's 2 galaxies away, which was way too far away, so Voyager simplified and made it within the galaxy, but the other side. So it's still really far away, but not so far that would be ridiculous to get home. Like here, they said it would take 300 years for them to get home. But yeah, I think it's a very interesting concept. I think the character of the Traveler was very interesting. And how when they ended up going to the place where it was their imaginations came alive. Like I talked about this in my Deep Space Nine reviews, because Deep Space Nine had an episode, what was it called? If Wishes Were Horses, where people's imaginations came alive. And that episode was terrible. And I, in fact, compared it to this episode to show how this episode actually did it correctly. This was the correct way to show people's imaginations coming to life, because the way it did in If Wishes Were Horses, where it was cheesy, it was inconsistent, it made no sense, whereas here it wasn't so cheesy. It felt like the way it was constructed, where you see this ensign doing the ballet, and you see another ensign playing the thing, and Riker Worf sees his Targ, and Picard sees his grandmother. I think it really sold, especially that scene where Picard goes. That's a classic image that's used a lot in a lot of the Next Generation marketing and production material and stuff. Is that promotional material? Is the scene where the image where Picard goes to exit the turbolift, and he's out in space, subspace, with the stars streaking past, and he goes, "Oh!" That was amazing. I think the way they handled this was a lot better than even, as I said, future incarnations that try to do something similar. So that was all very interesting. Now, the stuff with Wesley, with the Travelers saying, "Oh, you gotta," Wesley's like Mozart, but with subspace, like that was, I don't know. I thought it was a bit cheesy, and that was just a cheesy way to make Wesley a main crewman, because I had to come up with some excuse to put Wesley, a teenager, on the bridge, which I am still very much against overall. So Wesley's involvement, and the fact that Wesley kept trying to tell Riker that Traveler is phasing, and Riker's just like, "Not now, Wesley. I'm sure what you have to say is very interesting, but I'm too busy." Like, that was very contrived too. Like that seemed very sitcom-ish to me. So that kind of element I didn't really care for. But the stuff with the Traveler himself, like the way he talked, I actually really love, because it does sound a lot of New Age-ish. You can tell that Roddenberry, the writers of the episode, were injecting some of these New Age beliefs, which I actually really, from a philosophical perspective, agree with and found interesting, about how thought is more powerful and the way people perceive matter and space-time is actually a bit different than what they actually think it is. Like, I love that line of reasoning. I love the way they introduced it with the Traveler. So all that, I think, works. So I do think this is a good episode, but I think it has its faults. It still has that cheesiness of being in the first. It's a victim of being in the first half of season 1, which was and this inherent cheesiness to it. Anyway, let's get to the next episode, which we'll get back to the stinkers, which is Lonely Amongst Us. This was a very poorly executed episode about Picard getting controlled by this alien. It's a very generic story. An alien comes in the Enterprise and takes over someone's body, and I don't think the way it was executed was particularly interesting. It was mostly just boring, and the way they bring Picard back to life by reconstructing his body with the transporter was a bit space magic. I guess that's the only way to say this. It's a bit ridiculous. And throughout other parts of the episode where they're trying to, like, Riker and Troy are trying to figure out how to and Dr. Crusher trying to figure out how to relieve Picard of duty, where it's obvious, like, as soon as he said, "I've been taken over by an alien," they should have been like, shoot him with the phaser, take him to the sick bay. Done. Like, I mean, you have more than enough grounds to relieve him of duty by that. They waited too long, to the point, and by the time Crusher did, of course, he did those electrical things to make them all. But anyway, and then you had those, like, really horribly looking aliens, it was a side plot that didn't really amount to anything. These two aliens were, like, these lizard aliens, these ape aliens were, like, fighting against each other. Although they were more like meerkat looking aliens. But anyway, they were, like, hated each other, and they kept, like, attacking each other. And at the end of the episode, like, Yar comes in and reports that one of the aliens has been killed by the other aliens from the delegation. And so this is a pretty serious news. Like, someone has been killed. Someone's dead. These aliens came to your ship for protection, for diplomatic transportation, and one of them was murdered by one of their enemies, and the Enterprise crew let it happen. And so, do you know what Picard's response is to this very serious, deadly news is, quit bothering us, Yar. Can't you tell us later? Or can't you see we're busy? We're talking about being reunited. Can you just go away with this bullshit and deal with it? I'm too busy. What? Someone was just murdered on your ship, and that's your response? Go away. I'm too busy to deal with this. What the fuck? Picard's a terrible captain. Anyway, I'm sorry. Let me get into the next episode, which is justice. And now every time I say this name or think about this episode, I always think of that line from Star Trek 4 where the Klingon was like preaching to the Federation about trying to have Kirk arrested. It's like, we demand justice! I always think about that one. Anyway, kind of irrelevant. But this is an episode you might be surprised to hear that I actually gave this a positive rating to. This is my second positive rating. This is a 7 out of 10. Now, most people would name this as one. I've heard several people call this one of the worst episodes of Season 1. Now, Season 1 is terrible. I don't think this is anywhere near one of the worst episodes. I think Season 1 did a lot worse. I actually like this episode. Now, you feel like I need to justify myself. See what I did there? I feel like I need to justify myself here because I know a lot of people will be like, what the fuck is wrong with you, Mark? Well, how could you like this episode? Well, okay. First of all, let me concede this episode does have a lot of fault. I mean, it is extremely cheesy and does not age well with the cheesy 80s haircuts and they're running around in their skimpy outfits. And the laws that's at the heart of this episode actually doesn't make total sense. I'm actually more like kind of ethically, morally opposed to the implication because the implication in this episode is that so they choose a different spot, and in that spot, every crime, no matter how minor, is punishable by death. And so the implication here is that nobody ever commits any crimes because they don't know what spot is going to be the punishment spot, so so they just don't commit any crimes. So this is the thought that if people fear punishment, then they won't commit any crimes, which I think I'm morally, ethically opposed to. I don't think that is reality. Because that's, and again, this is getting, because I'm ethically opposed to the death penalty in real life, and I think, and harsh treatment of prisoners, and I think part of it because they think, oh, if people fear these punishments, they won't commit the crimes. But that is categorically proven not to be true. People will commit them anyway. They don't really consider fear of retribution or the punishment that they'll face for doing it. Never really factors in, particularly in crimes of passion or crimes of when they get in the heat of the moment and the emotion. Like, they're not going to care if maybe this zone is. Most people will probably be thinking, well, I got a high chance that this zone isn't selected for today, so fuck it, I'm just going to murder this guy, and this zone's not selected, I'll be off scot-free. I think a lot of how to deal with crime has more to do with how you structure your society and how you treat your citizens and the overall health and well-being of the citizens, and to lower the crime rate, which I think has been proven. Particularly, you look at countries like Norway that have like really, really lax, like their prisons are like resorts, and yet their crimes are like ridiculously lower than other places like the United States or other countries that are even worse, harsh treatment for the prisoners. Yet they still have, even though they're harsher on crime, their crime is worse. Where places that are more lenient, because they have better sort of society norms, they have more healthcare, more education, and it's because of that their crime rate is a lot lower. But anyway, sorry to go off on this political rant, but that's why I totally disagreed with the premise of this episode. Now, I'm still in the negatives. I haven't justified yet why I like this episode, but keeping on the negatives, the biggest negative to me is, which I think is like the biggest flaw in any episode in season 1, is when Tasha at the start of the episode says, I reviewed this planet's laws and rules. And really? And you just happen to miss their biggest one, where if you commit any crime and the zone has been selected, you're executed? That they execute people? You just happen to glaze over that? Now, the episode tries to excuse this later when Wesley is, arrested, and Riker goes to the yard. It's like, I thought you reviewed their laws. And she said, oh, they said nothing about punishment. Oh, well, that just excuses everything. They didn't say anything about punishment, so that's a totally legitimate excuse of why you didn't know about their most important fucking law, that where they kill people for falling on grass. That's ridiculous. No, Tasha, if I was Riker, I would have been like, so what? It's your fucking job to find out these things. You're fired. I would have sent her back to the ship and put her on confinement for incompetence. God damn it. How can you fucking not know about this law where they kill people for stepping on the wrong piece of grass? No excuse, Tasha. You're fired. Anyway. So that's the biggest flaw in this episode. Now, I actually do like this episode, and I'm sorry, but a good Picard speech goes a long way for me, because I love Picard speeches, and I think this episode features one of the best. Like, I did a video when I said my favorite Picard speeches, and I put this one in it, the one he gives to the Edo, the Edo God, I should say. At the end of the episode, where he's like, there can never be justice when laws are absolute. He's 100. I love this. He's 100% correct, and Riker even throws in a thing saying, well, when has justice ever been as simple as a rule book? Like, it's a really great speech. And plus, I love, that's not all I like about the episode, though, because I like the whole concept of this, the Edo God, I think was done very well, of how it was this ship that was like partially there, partially wasn't, and it's like this looming threat. And I love the dual like threat at the same time they deal with the situation with Wesley. They're also dealing with the possibility that this like godlike thing might destroy them for not following their own rules. And I thought the duality of that was played very well. I thought the character moments with Dr. Crusher, like being really fearful of her son's life and how this was affecting her, and Picard trying to reassure her, like that was all top notch. This was all done very well. I just love the internal dilemma that Picard faces, because on one hand, like, he needs to follow the Prime Directive. In fact, this alien might kill him if he doesn't. And on the other hand, he can't just leave one of his crew members to die from a very unfair law. So I love that internal conflict. By the way, at the end of the episode, these Edo are acting like Picard violating this law will destroy their whole culture. And yeah, so this law is so important to them that will destroy the whole culture, and yet they didn't bother to tell Yar about it when they were reviewing their laws. What the... Anyway, sorry. So, yes, I give this a 7. As I said, it has a lot of flaws, so it's not a great episode, but there's enough here that I get enjoyment out of watching this episode, unlike that garbage at the start of the season, which I get no enjoyment from, and even more garbage to come. Actually enjoyed this episode. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which is The Battle. So, this is that other Ferengi episode I was talking about. Now, granted, the Ferengi weren't quite as annoying, but they were still quite bad in this episode. They weren't done well. And I kind of like this episode a little bit because of the Stargazer. It's interesting to get a look into Picard's past and the ship that he used to command, but I never liked this episode. I always thought it was boring as hell. It always gave me a headache when I watched it. I don't know if it was just because Picard had a headache, or maybe I just happened to be sick. In fact, I was sick when I watched it this time. It seems like I'm always sick when I'm watching this episode. But anyway, I just think it was really boring, and the Daemon character was very two-dimensional. Die well, Picard! Like, that's, again, horrible dialogue. Really telegraphs. I don't really buy it. But another thing I always quote from this episode, I usually quote it when I'm talking about the episode The Price, even though it's a totally different episode, but the quote, he says the price. So, Damon, whatever, tells Picard he'll give him the Stargazer, and so his first officer's like, at the price, and then the Damon interrupts him and was like, no price! And so the other Ferengi is like, no price! And that's what I always quote him saying, no price! And I was surprised when I watched the episode, like, because usually when I quote stuff like that, I really exaggerate it, like in my head, and I end up quoting it. Like, for example, I remember quoting O'Brien from Deep Space Nine saying, "It gets me thinking," and I was like, "It gets me thinking." But when I watch the actual episode, he just says, "It gets me thinking." So I tend to exaggerate stuff like that in my head. But the thing with the no prize, I was like, I didn't exaggerate in my head. I watched the episode, and that's exactly how he says it. He's that silly and over the top. It's stupid. The way they portrayed Ferengi was so terrible. Anyway, this was a very boring, bland, bad episode, Squirt. So, let's get to the next episode, which is Hide and Q, and I'm going to say this is a negative. Some people might expect me to say it's positive. In fact, I don't like this episode. I made that determination. I wanted to like this episode when I was younger because, they're playing games on a planet and there's a penalty box. But really, like, that whole storyline was really contrived, and they kept talking about games. I should have kept, like, a count of how many times they said the word games, and yet they're just, like, fighting each other with muskets and shooting. How's that a game? That's not really a game. They should have done actual games. They should have sat down and played Twister like Bill and Ted did with the Grim Reaper. Those would be games. Come on, Q. Them just like a couple like pig-like things coming up with muskets and then like fighting him and Worf getting stabbed because he apparently sucks as a warrior. I don't know. Like, I don't really see that as games. And it kept saying games, it's games. But anyway, so and again, the dialogue is just so terrible. It was just so poorly written, and they haven't gotten Q right. He's still coming off as too menacing, and too like, blah, blah, blah. I guess they're slowly moving him more towards the Q that he will be, but at the moment, he's just like, I don't really, why, and him trying to turn Riker into a Q. That's also kind of inconsistent with how they're portrayed later on, but whatever, who cares? It's just a bad episode. Anyway, let me move over to the next episode, which is Haven, and I'm going to surprise you yet again and actually say it's the positive. Now, it's a 6, so it's a very low positive, but it's still a positive nonetheless. I actually enjoyed this episode, particularly now. I think I used to hate this when I was a kid. And this is kind of reinforced, and I know there's several people out there, especially strong patron supporter Colonel Doomsday of my channel, that disagrees with me heavily on this. We've had arguments about this in the past, and there's other YouTube channels I watch that disagree with me on this. But I'm sorry. This kind of, watching this episode reaffirms to me that I actually don't think Loxana Troy's that bad in Next Generation. I think she's much worse in Deep Space Nine. Talked about this in my coverage of Deep Space Nine. Every episode she was in Deep Space Nine, I think, is one of the worst episodes of Deep Space Nine. I think she was horrible on there. She had no business being on Deep Space Nine. Whereas in Next Generation, I kind of bought her, particularly in this episode. This episode in particular, I think, was a good introduction to her. Now, when I get into Season 2 next time, I'm going to talk about a really horrible episode she was in. So not every episode she was in Next Generation was good, but this one, I actually think she really worked, has this sort of whiny, complaining mother. Although the main issue I have is because Troy is doing that weird voice, that weird accent that she does. And she originally started doing that accent to try to have that be the Betazoid accent, but then you have Michael Barrett come on and be like, "Oh, Mr. Home," which is obviously not doing the same accent. I think they try to say that she got the accent from her father or something, but her father was human, so that doesn't, I don't know. Anyway, I kind of fucked that one up. But, I think, I don't know, the concept of the arranged marriage is kind of hard to swallow. But, if you move past that and assume that this advanced culture is still doing arranged marriages, then it was an interesting story. As I said, I think the characters came in, and I've heard other people complain about this episode being, I don't care about Troy being married, I don't really know her, but I think this episode like stands on its own. Like you don't need to know Troy that well to care about her. I think this episode does a good job of making you care about it because it makes you care about because the characters care about it. And a story is only as strong as you only get as involved in the stakes if the characters are involved in the stakes, and the characters obviously were. And so I think they actually did a really good job with that and the interaction between Troy's mother being obnoxious. Now, they did take it over the top sometimes, which is why I only give this episode a 6, and it did get annoying at times, although I gotta love that scene where Luoxan is at the dinner and Luoxan is just bitching with Wyatt's mother the whole time. They're just nee at each other so far, and Troy just has an outburst and be like, stop this petty bickering, especially you, mother, and just runs off and knocks that thing that Home is gonging to all night over, and then Data just turns like, could you continue with the petty bickering? I find it most intriguing. Like, come on. That was amazing. That was a good moment. And I also do like the storyline with the Tyrellians, although there's so many different aliens that have the same similar sounding name. They should stop it with that already. So I might even be saying it wrong. But the aliens that have that Vide disease, and Wyatt had been having dreams this whole time, although they never really explain why it is that he was connected to her. It's just some vague talk about thought not being connected. It sounded a bit like what the Traveler was saying, but they did not as good as a job this time around. I still don't buy it in this case, but it was fascinating. It was interesting how they were setting that up and how he thought Troy would be like that, but then realized that it wouldn't be her, and if it turned out to be this other person, he beamed over to devote his life to help them. I kind of like that. I mean, it's not the best story ever, but I think it was interesting enough, and I think, as I said, I felt invested enough in these guest stars and in the situation that they did a fairly good job. So I actually enjoyed this episode. I'm sorry, I do. Anyway, next episode is The Big Goodbye, and we get back to our negatives. Yeah, I don't like this episode. I mean, some people do see it as a fun holodeck episode. This was the first ever trapped in a holodeck episode, so you can't really blame it for being cliche because it's the first one, but it sets a trend of being that they use this over and over again, and it gets so annoying after a while. And yeah, and the safety protocols just conveniently get shut off. I mean, safety protocols seem to never work when they should. But again, this is the first time, so I can't blame it. But again, this is another poorly written, like the dialogue's poorly written, the way they're interacting with each other, and the way Picard's like, oh, blah, blah. It's just the way that these characters choose to interact. I just don't buy it. And the whole thing with those aliens, those insect-like aliens, or were they lizard-like aliens? I can't remember. I think they're insect-like aliens where Picard has to go and pronounce the speech like perfectly, like, you know, like, oh, you honor us by pronouncing it correctly. Like, that's all very contrived. But the one thing that kind of nitpick I had about this episode that really bothered me is that Picard goes into this, says, oh, we have time to goof around in Dixon Hill until we get this place. So he goes in the holodeck, and they get called by the Paradans. Are they called Paradans? I don't know. No, I think that's a different episode. They're, whatever the hell they're called. This insect race. They get called by them like almost immediately after he goes in. Like before Dr. Crusher even gets in there, they call him and Riker needs to find him. And they're like almost there. So why did he decide to go on this holodeck adventure and dress up like a couple hours before he's needed? That didn't seem very wise to me. And it was a big contraption. Also, another thing, at the end of the episode, we see Geordi and Wesley working outside the holodeck to try to get it open. They finally get it open. Yet when the doors open and Picard and those gangsters like step out, Wesley and LaForge aren't there. Now, you could say, oh, they're working in a different corridor, the different holodeck. Doesn't matter. They're trying, the whole point is to get Picard out of the holodeck. So as soon as those doors open, even if that's not where LaForge and Wesley are working, someone is going to be there at the door to try to make sure he's okay and get him out of there. That's the whole fucking point. So, so none of that I bought either. So, yeah, I don't know. It's the hard rain. It was a hard rain. The kind of rain that makes this episode suck. Anyway. Alright, so the next episode is Datalore, and this is the episode that has been, I used to like it a lot when I was younger, and I think it's generally looked on as pretty positively, but in recent years I've come to, actually look at this episode with fresh eyes and analyze it with an objective mind, and realize that it's actually not very good. It's your cliche evil twin stereotype, which was a cliche done to death by this stage. And again, it's bothered by the bad writing, bad dialogue that was inherent in Season 1. It's particularly bad in this case, and it doesn't really explain why the Enterprise is going to Data's homeworld after 22 or however many years that it's been. And it seems like they're investigating all this stuff for the first time. In 22 years, no one's ever bothered to investigate Data's origins. Like, I don't know. It's a bit hard to believe. And the whole thing with Lore, very obviously acting when he's sort of posing as Data. He's very obviously acting like Lore, and yet Wesley's the only one who notices. Now, as much as I do really get a kick out of seeing Picard say, "Shut up, Wesley," Wesley was actually right in this case, but that's annoying. It's annoying that Wesley always has to be the one that saves the day and that everyone else around him is a moron and can't see the obvious that the Data is, that Lore is impersonating Data. Now, I will say once I did see this in a special event at a movie theater because it was for the DVD or for the Blu-ray release of Season 1 of Next Gen. They showed this episode and then they showed Where No One Has Gone Before. Which Where No One Has Gone Before is obviously the better episode. But when they showed this episode, when Picard said, "Shut up, Wesley," everyone in the theater cheered. That was kind of cool. But, God, I don't know. Like, it's not the worst episode ever. Like, it's okay, but, it is too cheesy. It is way too cheesy. And it's and I'll cover this more when I get to Season 5. But it's interesting to me how when the crystalline entity reappears, they do something really thought-provoking and like realistic. Where here, he's just like this evil monster, and you hear Lore communicating with him, he, come and get more food, he. I don't know, something about it is really two-dimensional and cheesy. Especially the way Lore is like taunting Wesley. Do you know how much pain you deserved, man, child, or something like that? I don't know. It's all very cartoonish to me. So, not a very good episode. I'm sorry. So anyway, let me get to the next episode, which is Angel 1. Again, another bad episode. Yet again. So this episode is, supposed to be a matriarchal society run by women. Yet, I don't know. I'm not going to get into the gender politics of it all because this episode does come off as a bit sexist. But leave that aside, even though it's supposed to be like, I don't know what it's supposed to do. But I think it was one of the scripts that were like warped so many times from its original form that the final product that just came out was bleh. Now, it is somewhat interesting because there's this plague that gets on the Enterprise and everyone gets sick. And I don't know why Crusher's immune, but thank God she is immune because she's able to find a cure, but everyone else gets it except for her, so I don't know what makes her immune. But anyway, that's a good thing since she can find the cure. But anyway, while that's going on, there's these survivors that they took 7 years to find of a freighter who crashed on this planet, and they were seeking descent preaching equality in a female-dominated society, so the ruler wants to arrest them. Now, this is all interesting. I actually do kind of like this, and I like the little speech Riker gives, and he's able to convince her not to kill the dudes from giving a speech. But a lot of the specifics, a lot of the dialogue is just really cheesy and really badly written. And you have like that Riker getting it on with like the first one or whatever they call her, the ruler of the ruling council or whatever. That was dumb. I'm sorry, I did not care for that. I did not care for when Riker dressed up in that thing. How like Tasha and Troy were like making fun of him and being like, "Ooh, you look kind of sexy." Ooh, like, come on, don't be dicks. Like seriously, I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know. Not a very good episode. Anyway, we'll move over to the next episode, which is 11001001. Now, I did give this a negative rating, but it's a 5, so as I said, it's not that negative of a rating, but yeah, it's okay, I guess. I mean, I saw more of the negative side of okay, because it is, I mean, it's kind of boring, to be honest. Like, not much happens in it. Again, this is kind of an example where they do similar to what I was talking about with Star Trek The Motion Picture. They add a lot of pomp to kind of like pump up a flat story that's not really there. Like, for example, we get this intense scene with Picard and Riker being set auto-destruct, and they have him to do the whole auto-destruct sequence, and to make a huge point of showing the auto-destruct thing, but really that scene is irrelevant. Like, it serves no purpose other than, oh, we're going to ramp up the tension, blah, 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 blah. But, like, they didn't really need to set the auto-destruct. Like, I think they were overreacting a bit. And the whole scene was just, like, totally unnecessary. And a lot of the thing about spend so much time evacuating the Enterprise. Although, I will say that's a positive. I like the mechanics of how they evacuated the Enterprise, how they had like, you're on deck 3, you go to transporter room 6, or if you're on this deck, you go to the airlock, and like the way they had a computer reading out where everyone should go. Like, I liked that, made sense, but I think they spent way too much time on that because it didn't really have anything to do with the story. They're just pump. There's just a lot of pomp and circumstance because the story itself is really rather flat. And it doesn't really, because the Binars capture the Enterprise and they have Riker, they want Riker and Picard to be distracted so they can be their backup. And yet, like, when Picard and Riker do come on board after the Binars are like dying and they're incapacitated, like the whole point of having Picard and Riker there is so they could be their backup and install their program instead in case they were too incapacitated to do so. Yet they locked it out with a passcode. Now Picard and Riker keep saying, oh, it should be a passcode that's simple because they want us to know what it is. Why lock it out of the passcode at all if they want you to know what it is? Also, they say when they try to input it, they realize that Picard needs to be in the console right next to Riker so they can do it simultaneously because that's how the binars work. But the original plan was just to capture Riker. Them getting Picard was actually happenstance. So what the fuck would they have done if it was just Riker and there was no one else to sit in the console next to him and put it in simultaneously? They would have been screwed. So, I don't know. Holes in the plot, whatever. Kind of bother me. Now, let me talk about Minuet. And the more thing about Minuet, she's kind of the prototype for Vic Fontaine, as loath as I am to admit it, because I hate Vic Fontaine. I don't mind Minuet, though, because Minuet doesn't take 5 minutes of each episode singing a stupid Frank Sinatra song, and that wastes my fucking time. So she's fine by me. But not Vic. But she does seem like a kind of earlier prototype of a hologram who is very sort of self-aware and aware she's a hologram and is able to like read people very well and sort of interact and comfort with them and make them feel better. It's very much prototype because at first I was thinking she reminded me a bit of the Doctor, but not so much because the Doctor had no bedside manner whatsoever, even though the Doctor was similar in the fact that he was sentient and self-aware. I think she actually reminds me more of Vic Fontaine, but I'm being honest, done better, because she doesn't take 10 minutes of my episodes singing a fucking Frank Sinatra song. Anyway, she's okay, actually. I didn't mind Minuet. And to be honest, like, I had seen season 4 before I saw this episode. So I saw the episode Future Imperfect, which references Minuet, before I saw this episode. So I had no idea what the hell it was referencing. And until I saw this episode, I was like, oh, that's who Minuet is. Oh, I get it. It makes sense now. I think they did get the same actress to come back and play her, although she was dressed very differently, so I didn't recognize her. I think she looked totally different. But anyway, I mean, she was only in that brief little video clip in Future Imperfect anyway. But anyway, yeah, she was fine. This is fine. It's fine. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is too short a season. This is going to have to be negative as well, mainly because it's boring. It is a very bland episode. There's nothing really happening of interest. Like, they don't do a particularly good job of fleshing out these characters or the situation, and most of the script just involves this old man who we don't know, we never care about, we don't care about, who's de-aging, and then he starts dying, and he's being selfish because he wants to confront this thing in the past. And I think they're trying to make like sort of commentary on the Iran-Contra thingy or whatever about selling weapons to the enemy, but I just think they do such a poor job of that. And this guy who has this lust, I want Jameson, and most of the episode is like, I want Jameson dead, and they bring him in front, but he looks young, and he's like, that's not Jameson, Jameson's old. Picard's like, no, he's young. And he's like, no, he's old. No, he's young. No, he's old. All right, enough already. Jesus fucking Christ, just kill him and get it over with. Jesus Christ, this episode is boring. Anyway, let's get to the next episode. That is When the Bough Breaks, and I may surprise you again. I'm actually going to give this a positive. Again, a 6, so not a huge positive, but I like this episode. I like the character interactions. I think the stakes were fairly well designed. It wasn't like over dramatized like a lot of these first season episodes are. Like these dudes, and I kind of buy it. Like these society, the dudes that had that guy who would later play Mark Twain in season 5. All right, what does he say? I don't know. The same actor. He also played Deep Throat on the X-Files as well. But anyway, they have that actor. He's the head of society, and they steal the children because they become sterile. But then, of course, Crusher discovers that it's radiation poisoning that's making them sterilized, so the children that they steal will eventually become sterile if they're raised there as well. And of course this guy denies it. He's just trying to ease his conscience and be like, I'm not giving you children back, but I'll give you something better. And Picard agrees, goes along with this because he wants to stall them, because he doesn't want them to disappear forever. But they eventually find like holes in the shields, are able to beam in. Still, I think it was very exciting. I think it was very progressive, and I think, the plot progressed very well. And I think that I like the characters of the children. I think it was sort of well formed, and how that one chick like sort of grew attached to that little girl, and they like taught them different things. I think this is a well executed story, and it wasn't the most interesting story ever, but this in the next episode is when I start to realize that season 1 was actually getting better writing. Because that first batch of episodes, even though there's a few good ones mixed in there, but there's still terrible writing within those good ones, it was just horribly written, horribly constructed, and they were just not doing a good job of making a TV show. And this is when I could really see things to start to turn around, that they actually started to sort of tighten up. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is Home Soil, and again, may surprise you to hear another positive. Again, this episode, I could tell that it actually was a well-constructed story with characters that made sense and that you actually cared about, and everything was constructed well. Now, again, it's not the most interesting thing in the world. The episode is basically a rip-off of The Devil in the Dark. Kind of like The Naked Now, but not as obvious. They didn't call it like The Demon in the Dark or something, which they could have. But it's essentially the same plot, but a different location and different circumstances. Instead of like miners, it's a terraforming project, and instead of like this silicon creatures, these tiny little, were they silicon as well? I don't know, but these tiny little glowy ball thingies. But I like the way the mystery unraveled and the characters involved, and how this guy was like, I'm too busy, and Troy is like, that guy is freaked out. He's worried about something. You need to go investigate him. They go down and investigate, and they meet this other chick who's like, oh, here's the terraform. She's really happy, and Troy's like, yeah, she's just as open as you think. So it sets up this really interesting situation, and you have a murder, and you're trying to figure out which one of them done it, but then you realize it's the plot from Devil in the Dark. But that's all good, because then Picard has to negotiate with him, unlike the Devil in the Dark, where as soon as they communicate with Spock, they're all good. These aliens, still, you fucking killed us. We're going to go to war with you. And Picard sort of has to talk them down and protect his ship while at the same time trying to protect them. I thought it was interesting. Not the best thing ever, but it was okay. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is Coming of Age, and this is a negative. Yeah, I don't know. This episode's not good. It's funny. Why don't they just call a romantic comedy? They could call it romantic comedy, or if there's a horror, let's just call it the episode title horror. Because if you don't know what I'm getting at, Coming of Age is a genre type now. Maybe it wasn't a genre type when this came out, but anyway, it's boring. Wesley going to study, and I don't buy these tests. They did a short trek recently with Pike where it was like, it's actually watching this episode reminded me of that. I didn't like that either. I think it's cheesy where they do these tests and they present this scenario that the station's falling apart and there's an emergency, and we're like, haha, it's just a test. First of all, they could what if a real emergency happened? You ever heard of The Boy Who Cried Wolf? I don't think these people did. A real emergency happened, the cadets would be like, oh, this is just a test. Sure, you're injured. And poke them and they go, ah! I can just imagine that scenario. And secondly, how come Wesley didn't realize it? I mean, obviously he's like, sit here, your test is about to begin, and this emergency happens. Never even enters his mind as part of the test. Of course it's a fucking test. God! And I just don't care about Wesley going into Academy. And then you get this other plot, which is setting up for conspiracy, which I do like. The consistency. We actually have some continuity in season 1, which I love, but the actual characters of Remick and Quinn, Remick being the stereotypical cliche asshole. I want you, blah, 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 Picard's an asshole, tell me he's an asshole, blah, blah, blah. Not a good episode. Anyway, I will say, from here on out, all the episodes are positive, which is a change of pace, to be sure, because we had so many negative episodes in that first part of the season. I think we only have 6 episodes left, or 7 episodes, so they have a good streak. As I said, it gets better at the end of the season. We have a good streak here of positive episodes, but this next episode was just a 6, so it's not totally amazing, but at least it's positive, and that's Heart of Glory. This is like an early draft of what they could do with a Klingon episode. And it's because it's their first attempt at a Klingon episode. See, at this stage, you have to realize this is before Star Trek 6 came out. And so they never really explained how the Federation and Klingons' relations were. Like in season 1, just Worf was just on the Enterprise all of a sudden. When before that moment, you thought of the Klingons as every Star Trek fan, in canon, the Klingons were bad guys, they were villains. All of a sudden, there's one on the bridge. And so they're kind of backtracking here, but this is before they really established what the relations between the Klingons and the Federation are like, and I think it's quite different because we see this Klingon on his other ship, and he has a Klingon symbol and a Federation symbol behind him, so it's like implying that the two have kind of merged somehow, or that the alliance is like the most important thing ever, which is not what it's eventually described to be, which is actually a lot more realistic what they eventually describe it to be. Also, these other Klingons, like, are talking about fighting against the Federation alliance, and yet Worf is like all friendly with them. In future episodes, the Klingons, like in the Dora side, that try to sabotage the Federation alliance, he is very much against. So, but you do have some elements of, like, again, this is a prototype of a Klingon episode, so you learn more about Worf's backstory, about his parents being killed, and you get the prototype of them developing the Klingon culture further, because it's really Next Generation that created the Klingon culture, because you got some of it in the original series, not really, some of it in Star Trek 3 a bit more, but mostly it was Next Generation that created it. And you get some of the early glimpses of that warrior culture here, which is good. And I think the plot itself is exciting enough with them arresting the Klingons and breaking out of jail and then threatening to destroy the ship, or Worf just shooting them. Like, that was all cool. What I didn't like about this episode was in the first part where they go aboard this freighter that's going to blow up, and they hook up this like Geordi cam where they put the camera into Geordi's eyes, and Picard's saying, and Picard's spinning the whole time being like, oh, how come you see things that way? Oh, why is there aurora around Data? Oh, what's this like? And Riker's like, excuse me, but we're kind of need a job to do. And so they go in the freighter, they find the Klingons, and they try to get away from the engine before it blows up. They make it out just in the nick of time, like they barely escape with their lives. And that's because Picard was wasting time on the fucking Geordi cam. I mean, Picard could have killed them by slacking off. Jesus is another example of him being a horrible captain in season 1. He's just like, ooh, what does that look like, Geordi? I was like, excuse me, I'm on a ship that's going to blow up soon. Could you not bother me with that shit? In fact, they should have never bothered with that stupid Geordi cam anyway, which they never used again because, of course... Alright, so let me get to the next episode, which is the Arsenal of Freedom. I did really appreciate this episode, even though, like, watching it again, I didn't think it's not that good, but I always get enjoyment out of it, even though the basic premise is kind of dumb. Is like they go to looking for a starship, but obviously it's destroyed, and it's a planet that tries to sell weapons, but it was all the people there were wiped out, so it's just these automatic weapons going, and it's kind of exciting how each time they send out a different unit, it learns more, becomes more deadly. It's very Terminator-like. So it's very exciting. At the same time, the people on the planet are dealing with this shit. Geordi's up on the ship trying to deal with the thing that's attacking him, and there's the chief engineer, Logan, who's being a complete asshole to Geordi. And I don't know. I think he's being an asshole to an unrealistic extent, because at first he's like, "Oh, Geordi, you're gonna get the ship destroyed. You need to leave orbit. You need to leave orbit. Why aren't you leaving orbit, you idiot? Give me command so I can leave orbit. You're gonna get the ship destroyed. You're being so irresponsible." Then eventually Geordi's like, "Okay, take the ship out. We're gonna leave orbit." And he's like, "What? You're just gonna leave them behind?" I'm like, what the fuck? He's finally doing what you've been telling him to do. You've been bugging him, "Why don't you leave orbit?" And as soon as he does, he's like, "What, you're just going to leave the captain behind?" Shut the fuck up. Like, some people are like, that he was just like throwing his weight around and trying to be, because he outranks Geordi, he wanted to be controlled. But I just don't buy it. I think this is bad writing. It's just like he's being an asshole for the sake of being an asshole. I don't buy this character. Anyway, but and then you have Crusher and Picard on the planet, get stuck in this hole, and their dialogue's kind of boring. I'm not gonna lie, I'm gonna be honest. It gets boring. Like, the more interesting parts is the chasing after the machines. But then, like, they agree to buy buy the weapon merchandise of the holograms. It's like, oh, you're buying it, don't be sorry. So he turns it off, but somehow forgets to turn off the one in orbit going after the Enterprise. So Geordi has to destroy it. I don't really get how that works, but anyway, this episode has this. I'll still give it a positive. It's because it is an entertaining episode to watch, and I think it's one of the more entertaining ones of the first season. But this is the second and last time we'll see the saucer separation and the battle bridge, because it's not a good idea in the first place. Like, I think it was a dumb idea. Although it's not the last time some people point out best of both worlds, but that was kind of used in a distractionary tactic, and that was totally different than, because the original concept of it is that the saucer section has all the families and everything, so that flies to safety, while the other section, the star drive with the battle bridge, goes around, gets into battle whenever there's danger. But it never does this in the future. It always just takes the whole ship, because it's a waste of time. And plus, how is the saucer section going to safety if there's no warp drive on it? It's kind of a sitting duck. It's not really safe, is it? But anyway, I'm glad I got rid of that. It was a stupid concept to begin with. Let's get to the next episode, which is Symbiosis. And I really like this episode. In fact, watching it again, I realized that I really, really like this episode. I think this is a damn good episode. It was extremely well written, and it presents an interesting scenario. Now, I think throughout this is a very well structured, and there's no like terrible dialogue or setting up or like too obvious, like, oh, now we're in trouble now dialogue like there was for most of the season. It's actually really well constructed. When I first saw this episode for the first time, I'm like, it's a Star Trek II episode is what I call it, because that has two actors from Star Trek II. That has the guy who played Joachim and the guy who played Kirk's son. David was his name, I think. David Marcus. And it was like, hey, how... And I was distracted by the fact that this had two actors from Star Trek II. I was like, is this a sequel to Star Trek II? But no. It's just two actors in it who happen to be playing in the same episode with each other. I don't know. But anyway, I thought this episode was great because, of course, it gets into this really interesting moral dilemma where they find out, like, there's two alien species and one's trying to buy these medicine to save the world and the other's refusing. And this is obviously a commentary against capitalism, and they're refusing to give the medicine that could save everyone's lives. And I do think this is a really strong commentary against like insurance companies or drug companies, and basically the U.S., because it's the only developed country in the world that doesn't have socialized medicine. And so it's a very strong commentary against that, and how these drug companies would just let people die for their own profits, and these people came off as so despicable because of doing that. But you get a twist later in the episode when you find out that it's not actually medicine, that it's drugs, that it's narcotics. That once upon a time, these people did have a disease, but they no longer have it. Now they just think they do, and they're being lied to so they can sell these people drugs, and they're all drug addicts. So that's a very fascinating scenario to me, and that the way they played this out and they disseminated this information was beautiful. Plus, at least there's some comedy in this episode too, like at the start, where the freighters, the people who, the aliens who are drug addicts, are just like acting all drugged out, which they should do. And they're just like, when Picard's like, do you need help? And it's like, oh yeah, that would be great, man. And he's just like, can you repair that? It's like, oh, sure, thanks for trying, man. Oh wait, how do I repair this again? And they do it in such a way where it isn't too out of place or too comedical. Like, it feels natural for the story, but it's still kind of funny. So it really works. But then you have that extra element, and this is where I think a lot of people get lost, though, is the element of the Prime Directive. And because a lot of people, and especially in modern times, really don't like the Prime Directive or how it's applied in Star Trek in certain episodes. And so I think a lot of people sort of get a bit angry at Picard for following the Prime Directive. But I thought it was very interesting, and I like the little speech that he gives Crusher at the end, because she's very much against him not following. And I think it sets up a very dark scenario, and I do think Picard probably did do the best thing he did, is that he, acted as if he was never there, because it was his original intention to give these coils for them to repair their ships. But at the end, he's just like, repair them yourselves. And, if you think about it, they're so desperate, maybe they will figure out a way to repair the ships to get it going. But, Crush would argue that he should have told them that they were drug addicts, should have gave the plant medicine to deal with the withdrawal symptoms that they were about to suffer, which are all good, strong arguments. But then the other, aliens argued that he would really be affecting social change, dynamic in two worlds, and how, like Picard said, whenever human beings interfere with lesser developed peoples, the effects, no matter how good the intentions are, the effects are always negative. And I don't know, this isn't a case where some episodes where the planet's about to blow up and everyone's going to die. That's a bit different. We'll get to that later. But in this instance, I'm kind of with Picard here. And I think either whether you are or not, I think this is a very, very fascinating dilemma, and it was just really well constructed. So I really, especially watching this again, I realized that this is a really good episode. Anyway, let me get to the next episode, which is Skin of Evil. This is an episode I've heard a lot of people hate. Some people put this in their worst episodes, and I don't get that. I always liked this episode. I always thought this was a really good episode. And watching it again, it's not the best episode ever, but it's good. I think it's really well constructed. The suspense in it works. Now, I think some of the psychological stuff with Armors is where it loses me again. It gets a bit sort of boring with him being evil just for the sake of being evil. It's I am evil. And some of that back and forth between him and Troy and him and Picard, I think, gets a little boring, and being entertain me and stuff like that. But it's a really, I think the music in this episode is great, by the way. It's really good use of music, adds to the tension. And I like the dilemma. And a lot of people, of course, complain that it was just a really cheap way of killing off ER, because this monster just doesn't care and just kills her for the fuck of it. But it's for a demonstration of his power, basically, because they weren't taking him seriously. They were like, nah, fuck you, we're getting by you anyway. It's boom, dead. And I think it's interesting that they did this for a major character. Now, obviously, it's because Denise Crosby wanted to leave the show. But a lot of people complain in the manner that they kill her off. But actually, I like that. I like that it was just because usually this would happen to a red shirt and no one would care. This happens in Star Trek all the time. The red shirt was oh, Captain was over here. But this time it's not a red shirt. It's an actual main character. I like that. I like that it shows that people can just die, that Starfleet is a dangerous job. And I do, even though I think the ending with the funeral for Tasha, I thought was actually really touching. I thought it was a really great send-off for her character, and the stuff she says. And me, at first I thought maybe it was a bit over melodramatic, kind of like the Arium funeral in Discovery. But then watching this episode again, I realized it's nowhere near as bad as that. It actually works, unlike that Arium funeral, which really is over the top and not earned. This, I think, was earned. Anyway, we'll get into the next episode, which is We'll Always Have Paris. And okay, this is another 6, so it's just slightly a positive for me, because this is it's kind of interesting. It's kind of a throwaway episode. I never liked this episode when I was a kid, because it was about Picard having this old romance fling and feeling regret, and I was just oh, that's boring. But being older and more understanding, I can relate to that a bit more. I do find it a bit more interesting. But it's still not like the most interesting thing ever. And the use of time travel was kind of interesting, but when I look at this episode, I realize that the use of having the different time travel, like at first I thought, oh, it's so cool. We see Riker, Data, and Picard and Turbolift, they meet themselves and they say like, repeat the things, and they start talking to themselves, and that scene that's very classic at the end of the episode where there's 3 different Datas, and it's like, which one of us is in the right timeline? I am. Like, that is cool. Because I like how Picard showed that Data should be the only one in the away team, and it shows that was the right decision because because he's an android, he was able to look at it logically and not get too confused by the fact there's 3 different versions, and just think matter of factly, oh yeah, I'm the one in the right timeline. Okay, you go, which is cool, but. Ultimately, all the stuff with the time hiccups and time travel and stuff is incidental. Like, it could have been anything. Like, the main point of the plot is there's a dilemma where everyone's going to die, and that's mainly the side plot about Picard and his old fling just happens to be married to the scientist who created this dilemma. The dilemma could have been anything. It could have involved time travel. It could have involved funky space anomaly. It could have involved, like, ants. I don't know. It could have been anything. So the time travel is kind of incidental to the episode and just there to look cool. But it does look cool. I will say that. So, yeah, I mean, it's basically just an okay episode. Anyway, let's get to the next episode, which is Conspiracy. So this is a really good episode. This is a unique episode in The Next Generation. I don't think there's any other episode like this. Now, I read an article once that called this the best episode of Next Generation. I wouldn't call any episode from Season 1 the best. I think that's just insulting Next Generation. And I wouldn't even go as far as to put this in my top 10. But it's definitely one of the better episodes of Season 1, although that's not saying much. But it definitely is, because it is, again, a well-constructed episode. There's some cheesy dialogue in this episode, like when the Admiral Quinn is attacking Worf, and he's like, now, Klingon, it's just you and me. And they play the music, da-da-da-da. I'm like, all right. You're going over the top again. But most of the episode is actually really dark in a really good way, in a well-constructed way, where it gets into this conspiracy. Now, Roddenberry is very much against this episode at first, and eventually he kind of let it slide, though, because it's aliens, because he's against there being a conspiracy within Starfleet. He wanted all conflicts to be external, but because the ultimate thing is, well, it's aliens that are taking over Starfleet, well, that's okay, because it's not the humans themselves, it's the aliens that are doing it, which sort of set the stage for Star Trek VI, when they actually had a conspiracy within Starfleet, which Roddenberry was more against, because it wasn't aliens, it was actually humans doing it, and which Roddenberry actually tried to get Star Trek VI blocked from being released, if you can imagine that, but he passed away before it was released, so I don't know, that's kind of a sad story, but anyway, the way they had disseminated the conspiracy, they had the different captains that knew Picard, although it does annoy me that Walker Keel, I think his name is, that Picard and Beverly acting like they're like the old best friends and they love each other, and like they knew Jack and they were like this circle of friends and they're so close, and that he introduced Beverly to Jack and they're just like the oldest of friends, and Beverly's like, oh, did you see Walker? Oh, I want to see him. And he dies in this episode and never mentioned again. Never mentioned before, never mentioned again. That does kind of annoy me, but what are you going to do? I do think ultimately, and plus, like, the violence they had in this episode, like that scene at the end where they, like, blast Riddick's head off, and they had the effect where his skull just, like, explodes, and they open his chest, bursts open, and there's, like, this monster swimming inside his innards. How the fuck did they get away with this on TV? I mean, granted, it's syndicated TV and not broadcast TV, but that all makes it worse because sometimes it airs during the day when kids see it. How do they get away with this shit? And generally speaking, a lot of people think Next Generation's a kid family show, but this is like some gruesome horror shit. It's like from Alien. I don't know, but I like it. Anyway. Anyway, yes, I think that's a good episode. Anyway, so we'll get to the finale, which is the neutral zone. Now, the episode's called the neutral zone, but the plot about the Romulan and the neutral zone is kind of just a side plot. It's mainly about this 20th century people who were found frozen and being unfrozen caveman Wall Street guy. And how there's 3 people in Data unfreezes them. Now, I kind of get annoyed in this episode the way Picard is so nonchalant. He's like, hey, Picard and Riker and everyone gets pissed off. Why do you waste time unfreezing them? We have more important things to do. Why don't you just leave them there? I'm like, that's fucking heartless. These are real people who need help. They need assistance. They need to be brought back to life. They're just sitting in space frozen, and nobody seems to give a fuck except for the androids. So that part of it annoys me. But one thing I love about this episode, which I know some people with different political opinions might not like, is because I do agree with Roddenberry's vision of the future and of a moneyless future where humanity works to better themselves. It's not all about profit, and how antiquated the Wall Street guy is, and how Picard is like making fun of him and putting him down and being like, look, humanity has evolved beyond its infancy. We're no longer obsessed with material things. And the guy's like, oh, what about my portfolio? I want to contact my lawyers. And Picard's like, no, that shit exists anymore. Get your head out of your ass. And some of their interactions I actually love. So I actually really like this episode because of that. Because of the preachiness of putting down the monetary system. But I know Star Trek, I think Roddenberry was very heavily involved. And Maurice Hurley tried to act as a surrogate to Roddenberry in a lot of cases. So he tried to push what Roddenberry would want, even though he personally didn't agree with it because it was his job. So Season 1 definitely had this stronger feel of it. Now, later seasons of Star Trek, particularly later shows of Star Trek, and I'm not just talking about the more recent ones like Discovery, Picard, even Voyager and Deep Space Nine, the writers obviously didn't understand this moneyless society concept or didn't agree with it. Like Ronald D. Moore has been on record saying that he didn't agree with it, and sometimes characters in Deep Space Nine would actively make fun of that. And that annoyed me because I actually do agree with it, but it would take me too long. I would have to do a whole video about why I do, because you might say, oh, it's not practical. I think those arguments are really fail to see the point of it, and are wrong. I think it is practical, but again, it would take me forever to get into it, so I'm not going to get into it here. Just suffice to say, I do really like this episode because of that. The Romulan part of it was kind of, we get to see Mark Alamu play a Romulan, which is always fun, and he does a good job in sort of precursoring Dukat. And it's kind of interesting, but this is when these weird alien force scooped all the outposts off the neutral zone. And obviously this was supposed to be the Borg. Originally, this was supposed to set up for the Borg, who were going to be introduced in the start of Season 2 and be a sort of long-term character throughout Season 2, but because of the writer's strike, all those plans got pushed aside. In fact, eventually Maurice Hurley had to fight to finally do the Borg in Q-Who, because the producers or whatever wanted to move beyond that and kind of move past the Borg. But the original, and I think even at this stage, the Borg were supposed to be insectoids rather than cybernetic life forms. But that's obviously what it was supposed to do, but now because it was rewritten that way, it doesn't really make sense why the Borg would have attacked a neutral zone at this case when they're later portrayed to be all the way in the Delta Quadrant. So this is kind of a hole in canon, which I don't know. I'm wondering if shows like Picard or something else might fill in. I'm pretty sure there was these novels that aren't canon and tried to fill in these holes and explain how this happened. But anyway, I did think it was a bit cheesy the way the Romulans oh, well, the whole point is we're back. Dun 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 dun. I'm like, all right, that's again, you're being a bit over the top with it. This episode's totally retconning the fact, by the way, that the Romulans were mentioned in Angel 1 and that the Romulans and the Federation of Starfleet were having a conflict, because in this episode it's oh, we haven't heard from the Romulans in 80 years. So it's obviously just retconning an episode that occurred like 5 episodes ago, not that long ago. But, whatever. I don't think they should have bothered with any of that. They've been gone for 80 years and now we're back. Da 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 da. Like they were just trying to re-emphasize. Now, because obviously, if you haven't heard this before, the Ferengi were originally supposed to be the big villains of Next Generation, but as I said, the first 2 appearances went terrible, so they very wisely decided to pivot from the Ferengi to the Romulans, which was a very wise choice, and that's why they were first mentioned in Angel 1, but this is when they go full on. They decided by the finale that, yeah, let's commit to the Romulans being the big bad guys, and I think that was the right decision to make. So, anyway, that is all the episodes of Next Generation Season 1. So, let me do what I normally do. Give my my choice for best episode of the season and my choice for worst episode of the season. So, let me start with my choice for worst episode of the season. And although I said I didn't hate this episode as much as the others and that it didn't really appear in any top 10s I did previously, I'm going to have to say the worst episode of the season is Code of Honor. It was just an all-around badly written, badly executed episode. It's like, I do think that the racism is unintentional. I think it's just due to how poorly executed it was. But it's still just not an interesting episode about this guy trying to, in an alien culture, trying to kidnap Tasha to gain power. And it's just, everything about the acting, the dialogue, the way it was executed, everything about this, it's just a disaster. It is a huge disaster. I mean, there are a lot of terrible episodes in Season 1 that were poorly written, with really bad dialogue, but this definitely takes the case. Anyway, best episode of Season 1, I'm actually going to have to say Symbiosis, which I know some people might disagree with. Some people might say Skin of Evil or Conspiracy or Where No One Has Gone Before. In fact, I might have said Where No One Has Gone Before previously, but I really think it is Symbiosis. I do think this is the one episode from the season which I think holds up to the rest of the series. Like the other episodes, like Conspiracy, like that's good for Season 1, but not all that great when you compare it to the rest of the show. Whereas Symbiosis, I think, is a great episode. It's a great moral dilemma. I think it's acted, constructed very well. The characters come off as interesting. I love the interactions between Picard and Beverly. So yeah, I think this is the best episode of Season 1. So, anyway, my rating for Star Trek Next Generation Season 1 out of 10 is a 3. Extremely poor. As I said, this was a tough season to get through. Particularly that first half was just awful, particularly because I've already seen these episodes like a billion times before and I have to sit through this crap again. But it does get better later on in the later half of the season. As I said, like those last end of episodes are running pretty good episode after pretty good episode. Other than Symbiosis, doesn't really get excellent or amazing, but still it gets decent. And plus, as I said, the baseline of the characters is there. Like, it's strong infrastructure with interesting characters. It's just the writing failed to live up to what's set up. It's all there for them to actually do something good with in later seasons. They just didn't really accomplish that. So that's why it gets a 3, not a 2 or 1 or something. Because there's some good parts to Season 1. But yeah, definitely not a positive rating. Anyway, that is it for my review of Star Trek Next Generation Season 1. I will be back in probably just a couple of weeks, hopefully, to review Season 2 of Next Generation. So be sure to check out my channel for that. Also, check out my channel as I cover many other shows like Picard, The Expanse, Better Call Saul, Star Trek, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. Thanks a lot for watching.